This is the Black Information Network Daily Podcast, and I'm your host, Ramses Ja. And sometimes the amount of stories that make their way to us means that we simply can't cover everything that comes our way. But from time to time, a story just stays with me, and I feel compelled to share it with you and give you my thoughts. And now, one more thing.
I got one more thing I'd like to talk to you about right now.
By the way, what happened to those people? Are those people in jail with the J6 hostages? What happened to those people, come to think of it? They're not in jail with the J6 hostages. I don't call them prisoners, I call them hostages. They're hostages.
That, of course, was the former president of the United States of America discussing January 6th and the people that engaged in the insurrection, referring to them specifically as hostages rather than prisoners, criminals, or terrorists, which is now an objective truth, given that there have been so many of these individuals engaged in this action that have been committed against the United States who are now in prison, sentenced. And since we're knocking on the 3-year anniversary of the January 6th insurrection, I felt like it was timely to discuss not just this, but something that has been happening for some time that I'm sure we're all aware of, which is attacks on the narrative. Now, we've all lived through some things, and we know that typically what happens initially is, at least the version of the story that we get is incomplete. And then after a few weeks, few months, maybe even a year or so, we have a better idea of what happened. But in this instance, we're 3 years removed from the actual incident, and these folks are trying really hard to chronicle a separate, detached from reality version of a narrative into public consciousness. And these attacks have taken place in other areas as well. I remember once upon a time being woke was a good thing. Certainly wouldn't want to be asleep. But because of the constant attacks on the narrative that runs alongside the term woke, that word is less fashionable, we'll say. Of course, there have been attacks on American history. It was rebranded as critical race theory. And then all of a sudden, because they interjected the sensibilities and feelings of children into the narrative, they were able to persuade a significant amount of the population into believing that critical race theory was somehow anti-American, when indeed it was the full teaching of American history. And of course, you know, something that's closer to what we're talking about today, the election being stolen. And there are people who still feel that way. Despite all of these nearly billion-dollar lawsuits, despite, everything that's happening with Giuliani and everything that's continuing to happen, there are still people who feel like the system is rigged against them. The election was stolen. They wanted once upon a time for all these things to be decided in courts. And now that the court's opinions aren't going in their way, they're looking at the courts like they're somehow compromised. That all the legislation is compromised, even if it's Republican legislation, Republican-led efforts. And so this narrative is something that we really need to pay particular attention to. And after 3 years, with this man calling these prisoners, these terrorists, these criminals, hostages, we have to be very careful here. I want to share a bit from Huffington Post that gives you a clearer idea of what it means to be a quote unquote hostage from January 6th. A Florida Proud Boy who claimed he was trying to help police on January 6, 2021 by throwing a rock at the Capitol doors was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Anthony Sargent, age 47, pleaded guilty earlier this year to a felony charge of civil disorder and 6 misdemeanor charges, including engaging in physical violence in a restricted building and disorderly conduct. The day of the Capitol attack, Sargent could be seen on video repeatedly throwing a rock at the Capitol doors and encouraging others to attack the building. Sargent also physically separated a law enforcement officer from a rioter and prevented the officer from apprehending the rioter, according to the Justice Department. Law enforcement eventually identified Sargent through videos, his cell phone data, social media history, and tattoos on his knuckles. Investigators also discovered Sargent's affiliation with the neo-fascist gang, the Proud Boys, through a HuffPost video charging documents show. During his sentencing, Sargent attempted to downplay his role in the violence, telling U.S. District Judge Dabney Friedrich that he was trying to help police officers when he repeatedly threw a rock at the Capitol doors. Friedrich called the claim laughable. Quote, "To say he broke glass to get inside the Capitol to help people, I'm not buying that story at all," Friedrich said, according to a report in the courtroom. Though prosecutors had asked for a 46-month sentence for Sargent, Friedrich raised the sentence to 60 months. Sargent joins a growing list of Proud Boys who have been sentenced for their role in the attack. Okay. So, by this person's own admission, they are guilty of attacking the Capitol. Okay. And let's not forget the reason why they were all there. They were summoned by their president to stop the certification of the election. And the narrative initially that they were trying to chronicle was that this was a rowdy tour. They were trying to suggest that this was somehow Antifa, BLM, all kinds of stuff. And then now, of course, they want to chronicle that they're hostages. But I want to share something with you that I posted to my social media the other day. And I think it's appropriate for this conversation. It says, over 800 terrorists pleaded guilty to crimes on January 6th. Not one Democrat, not one atheist, not one Muslim, not one BLM, not one Antifa. All of them were Christian, fascist, Republican terrorists. 100% of them. So let's not lose the narrative here. 3 years later, it's a shame that we still have to push back against nonsense. But this is where we are. This is who we're up against. And the fact of the matter is that, in theory, the truth doesn't care about your feelings about it. But in the real world, we're seeing that people's feelings about the truth really do inform which version of the truth gets chronicled. And so it's up to us who are objective, who have seen what happened, who know full well exactly what's going on, realize the election was not stolen. There was an attempt at stealing the election by the former president. And as is always the case, when he doesn't get his way, he will do his best to rewrite the story, which is now step number 1 in the MAGA handbook. So again, this is the game that we're playing now. It's up to us to hold on to the truth. Let's not lose the narrative. And let's call these people what they are. Terrorists, criminals, and prisoners. Now, as always, you're free to disagree with me. You can do so using the red microphone talkback feature on the iHeartRadio app, or you can hit me on all social media at RamsesJah. I'd love to talk to you about it. And until I do, peace. This has been a production of the Black Information Network. Today's show is produced by Chris Thompson. Have some thoughts you'd like to share? Use the red microphone talkback feature on the iHeartRadio app. While you're there, be sure to hit subscribe and download all of our episodes. I am your host, RamsesJah, on all social media. Join us tomorrow as we share our news with our voice, from our perspective, right here on the Black Information Network Daily Podcast.